And he tells it in such a way that his ideal audience makes sense and understands. Okay? That's step number 1 of audience hacking. And so I said, Brad, we need to take you through the audience hacking framework. We need to sit down and here's how we're going to launch your group. He goes, all right, I'm ready to rock and roll. I said, the first thing that we need to do is we need to figure out what your messaging is. What is your messaging? All right. So step number 1 of audience hacking is messaging. Let me explain to you what I mean by this. Okay. Brad and I, the very first time that we ever met, we met at Ruth Chris Steakhouse. It was in Boise, Idaho. We were at a Steve Larson event out there, and we sit down and we have dinner. And Brad blows my mind, right? Because we talked for 4 hours, and he's telling me about the economy and the stock market and how he used to work at Goldman Sachs and all they do for their customers and their blah 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 and all this type of stuff. And at the end, I look at him and I go, "This is incredible, right? Like this is absolutely amazing. Why don't you have a podcast? Why don't you have a Facebook group, right?" And he goes, "Josh, because the only way I can educate and convince people that they need my services is when we sit down and have a 2 or 3 hour conversation like this. If I could sit down and have a 2 or 3 hour long conversation with everybody like you just did, like we just did together, I would sell everybody that I sit down with. But because I can't do that, and because I don't know what the person is after, I was like," he goes, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to go in and bring my audience together. And that is the power of having a message versus not having a message, okay? So, and actually, let me back up there and give a little bit more context, because that's the negative side of not having a message. On the flip side of that, you look at Steve Larson. Steve Larson, whose event we were at when Brad and I met, all right, is just as smart as Brad Gibb is about what Steve does. Steve does offer creation. Brad does finance and money, okay? Steve is very, very smart at what he does there. Brad is very, very smart at what he does. Steve was able to go and get 500 people at an event. Brad wasn't. He couldn't even get a Facebook group launched. Why? Because Steve Larson had his messaging down. It wasn't because Steve Larson was smarter. It was because Steve Larson took the time to figure out his messaging. Brad had not yet. Okay? See the difference here? So what we need to do before we figure out our Facebook group, what we're going to launch, what we're going to, how we're going to say it, who it is, all this stuff, what we're selling, how we're going to do all this, we've got to figure out what our messaging is, because we don't have the luxury to be able to go and sit down and have a 2 or 3 hour conversation with every single person. We need to be able to figure out enough about our dream our audience, to figure out, okay, this is the type of person that we're after. This is their core desire. This is what we teach. That is our messaging. Okay. Steve was able to figure that out. Brad hadn't. So when I came in, the first thing that I did, which is step number 1 of audience hacking, is I said, Brad, we've got to get clear on our messaging. And we worked a lot, and we really dived down deep into this to figure out the messaging. Now, messaging consists of 3 parts. All right. Part number 1 is the who. Part number 2 is the story that you're going to tell your who. And part number 3 is your big promise. Okay. So let me break this down. The who is your dream customer. Okay. Who is that? When you identify who that is and you get very clear on your dream customer, then you can figure out what you're going to tell them in order to get them to be interested, right? So I sat down, I said, Brad, who is your dream customer? And he's like, well, it's, this type of person, they work at a job. And keep in mind, Brad serves entrepreneurs, but his audience is actually 80% 80% employees, right? He works with entrepreneurs at the very, very high level, but a lot of the people that come to him are actually employee type people, okay? So he's like, they're employees, they're this type of person, they want to achieve financial freedom, they have these struggles, they are listening to the traditional way of money, blah, blah, blah. We get super, super clear on this. And I was like, amazing. Okay, now that we've got this, I was like, Brad, what story can we tell them in order to get them to be interested in you and what you guys do? And he's like, well, I don't know. And I said, okay, so let me ask a question a different way. What big promise or big result are you going to get them if they come over here and follow them? And he goes, Josh, I can make anybody financially free in 10 years or less if they follow what I tell them to do. Boom, right? Big promise. Financial freedom in 10 years or less. All right? Now, if I were to go to you and say, hey, you can achieve financial freedom in 10 years or less. And then I have no idea who you are, but let's just assume that you are making $60,000 a year and you're an entrepreneur. All right? Like, let's just assume that that's what it is. And I were to go to somebody else that works a 9-to-5 job and say, you can achieve financial freedom in 10 years or less. And I go to somebody else that's working a part-time college kid, right? And you can achieve financial freedom in 10 years or less. My messaging is going to be way different to every single one of those people, right? So we had to figure out who my ideal person is. And then once I've identified, okay, this is the type of person that I want to go after, I was like, okay, Brad, now if the promise that you're going to get this very specific person is financial freedom in 10 years or less, what story can you tell them that will allow you to allow them to resonate with your message and be interested in what you have to say? And he goes, oh my gosh, I've got the story. Ryan's story. It's not mine, it's Ryan's, right? And I was like, ding, 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 ding. Okay. And it could have been his. We just used Ryan's because we wanted to incorporate Ryan into it, okay? So now we've got our messaging down because we figured out who our person was. We figured out what the story was that we were telling them. And then we figured out the big promise that's going to hook them in. So now we can say, do you want to achieve financial freedom in 10 years or less? There's our big promise. Well, guess what? I was on that same path, and here's my story. Tells him the story of how he achieved financial freedom in 10 years or less. And he tells it in such a way that his ideal audience makes sense and understands. Okay? That's step number 1 of audience hacking. I get clear on who my messaging is.